The Justice Department has indicted 2 Chinese nationals accused of hacking into companies developing coronavirus vaccines and treatments. The 11 charges include trade secret theft and wire fraud conspiracy. According to the indictment, the hackers never obtained any research. Officials allege they were working not just for personal gain, but on the behalf of the Chinese government.
China has now taken its place alongside Russia, Iran, and North Korea in that shameful club of nations that provide a safe haven for cyber criminals in exchange for those criminals being on call for the benefit of the state. Here to feed the Chinese Communist Party's appetite for American and other non-Chinese companies' hard-earned intellectual property, including COVID-19 research.
Pretty remarkable. For more on this, we're bringing in CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. So, Catherine, break down this indictment for us just a bit more, and what else can you tell us about the defendants in this case?
So, Errol, according to this indictment, there are 2 Chinese hackers, and the accusation is that they've been part of this global campaign to steal government secrets, business secrets, and more recently to target COVID-19 research. And what's key about these 2 guys is that they straddle this space between criminal activities, so they steal information for profit, often information that's developed at great expense by countries like the United States, and they steal the information when it's ripe to be used, so the investment is complete. And then also the indictment alleges that they're working really hand in glove with the Chinese Communist Party and their intelligence services to obtain information that would be desirable and beneficial to that government. We don't know a lot about these 2 individuals except what comes from the indictment, but they seem to have a pretty long history together. It says they went to their former classmates and they studied chemical engineering. And it also says that they've been doing this and working together for about a decade. And when you read through the indictment, Errol, what you see is that virtually every Western nation has been touched by this hacking enterprise.
I also found it interesting that, according to the indictment, they didn't obtain any research. So can you tell us more about what type of information they did obtain or that they were after?
One of the things that comes through in the indictment, Errol, is that there's really a 2-step process with these Chinese hackers. Number one, they do what amounts to reconnaissance and surveillance of their target. In this case, they were studying vulnerabilities at websites and infrastructure and networks that were associated with companies inside the United States that were researching cures or vaccines or therapies for COVID-19. According to the indictment, there were 2 in late January, 1 in Maryland and also 1 in Massachusetts. These were biotech firms that were working on a vaccine. And then the last that's cited was in February of this year, and this was a biotech firm in California. It was working on antiviral COVID drugs. And what's also key here is that the hackers were tracking what was going on in the news. So once a company became very public about the research they were doing, these hackers would then zero in on them. They would study their systems, look for vulnerabilities to try and access that information.
So that was effectively the scheme at work. Look for public information and then try and either obtain that information themselves or at least identify weaknesses in the chain.
Well, that's right. The scheme worked like this, sort of as a general picture. They would find an individual who was at the center of, let's say, a business secret or a government secret, or in this case, a COVID secret that was very attractive either to a criminal client or to the Chinese government. They would build a profile of that individual. That's a way to understand their personal information. And then they would try and obtain their credentials to get into the system. So their username and their password. And then once they were inside the system, they would, I found this the most interesting part of the indictment, they would operate from the recycle bin because systems administrators typically were not monitoring the recycle bin. And this is where they would launch their operations to steal the information.
What are we always told? Empty the trash on your desktop, folks. Sometimes it's the smallest details, really, that folks can get through. So then what are the next steps for prosecution in this case? And have we heard any reaction yet from the Chinese government on this indictment?
Well, based on my 2 decades of working in this national security space, this really has the feel of a very serious indictment. But the likelihood the Chinese government is going to extradite these individuals to the United States for trial is zero, right? So this is really like putting a marker down on the table. It's the United States, in effect, naming and shaming these individuals, as well as the Communist Party in China for the theft of American secrets, global secrets, and now more recently trying to target or allegedly target research related to COVID-19. I say in the big picture, what you're seeing now with the Trump administration is they're building the public case against the Communist Party and in effect, the Chinese government over COVID-19. It began a few weeks ago with the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. Then that was followed by the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, who made the case about Chinese economic espionage. Then last week, it was the Attorney General who gave a big speech about the role that U.S. companies can play and not bending to the pressure of the Chinese government. And then today we have this very public indictment. For their part, the Chinese embassy here in Washington told CBS News that they didn't need to steal in order to have the advantage in the race for the vaccine. And they also said they were willing to work with some countries. So I felt that code was pretty interesting, some countries, in terms of trying to find some sort of treatment or not cure, but, vaccine that would be effective with COVID-19.
So when you put all that together, Catherine, this virus continues to get worse here in the U.S. As you note, President Trump really pointing the finger at China. Is this a cooling of the relationship between the two? This doesn't seem to be helpful in any way.
Right. I mean, my analysis based on my reporting here at CBS News and then our interview last week with President Trump is that there really is an escalation in the tension between the relationship, the U.S. and China. And we see, as I just mentioned, the administration publicly making the case against China. But then I think what we're also seeing is that China has, in effect, I'm not sure taking advantage is the right term, but in the aftermath of COVID-19, what we've seen, they've expanded their territorial ambitions in the South China Sea over these disputed islands. They've cracked down in Hong Kong. And now we have evidence from this indictment that they've been seeking to take advantage of the research that's being done here in the United States to try and find some type of intervention with COVID-19. And so the question really for folks at home to answer is whether they feel China was truly transparent about the threat of COVID-19 back in January of this year, and whether they're taking actions today that may seek to capitalize on the vacuum that has been left globally and also economically in the wake of the virus.
Yeah, so many interesting layers to all of this. Our senior investigative correspondent, Catherine Herridge, always great to see you. Thanks very much.
You're welcome, of course.